Raymond Miller, a 73-year-old farmer, faces losing his family's land, a century-old legacy, to a county auction due to unpaid taxes and paperwork errors. Clutching his life savings in cash, he's humiliated and ejected from the auction for not having a bank guarantee. As investors bid on his farm, a viral video of his mistreatment sparks outrage. Unexpectedly, Governor Karen Langford arrives, halting the auction. Her intervention, prompted by Ray's heartfelt letter, exposes procedural flaws. The stage is set for a dramatic confrontation, leaving readers eager to discover if justice will prevail for Ray's cherished heritage. Love stories of resilience and justice? Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories. Join our community to uncover powerful tales of everyday heroes like Ray Miller. Your support helps us share these inspiring narratives. Hit subscribe, share, and type justice to show kindness matters. Visit QH for more. The sting of rejection hit Raymond Miller like a cold wind across the open fields he'd worked his whole life. Folks like you do not belong in a place like this, the auctioneer spat, his voice dripping with disdain as he yanked the registration form from Ray's trembling hands. The room erupted in cruel laughter, a sound that echoed in Ray's ears like the cawing of crows over a barren harvest. The elderly farmer, his weathered face flushed with humiliation, was ushered out by two burly security guards, their grips firm but impersonal. In his gnarled hands, he still clutched a tattered envelope stuffed with every dollar he'd ever saved. As the heavy glass doors of the auction hall swung shut behind him, Ray felt the weight of his 73 years pressing down, each step toward the exit a reminder of the legacy he was fighting to preserve. Unbeknownst to the jeering crowd inside, a security camera mounted above the doorway had recorded every moment of his public shaming. And just 5 minutes later, the laughter inside the hall would be silenced by the screech of tires as the governor's SUV Convoy roared to a stop outside, kicking up dust and demanding answers. Raymond Miller was no stranger to hardship. At 73, he was a man carved by the land he'd tended in Lacy County, his hands rough as the bark of the oak trees that lined his property. Those hands told a story of decades spent coaxing life from the soil, a labor begun by his grandfather in 1927. To Ray, the Miller farm wasn't just a plot of land, it was the heartbeat of his family's history, a living testament to their resilience. His grandfather had clung to every acre through the choking dust of the Great Depression, refusing to let the land slip away. His father had steered the farm through the mid-century's technological shifts, balancing tradition with just enough innovation to survive. Ray, in turn, had honored their legacy, adapting to modern demands while holding fast to the old ways. Profit had never been his goal, survival was. The farm was his identity, the only home he'd ever known, and the thought of losing it was like imagining his own heart being ripped from his chest. But the past year had tested Ray's resolve in ways he hadn't foreseen. After his wife, Clara, passed 2 winters ago, the world seemed to dim, and the farm's paperwork, once meticulously managed, fell into disarray. Unpaid back taxes, compounded by clerical errors at the county office, had snowballed into a debt Ray hadn't even known existed until a cold official letter arrived in his mailbox. The notice declared his farm slated for public auction, giving him just 45 days to save the land that had defined his family for nearly a century. Standing in his kitchen, the letter trembling in his hands, Ray had whispered, "This can't be right." He drove to the county clerk's office the next morning, his heart heavy with a mix of hope and dread. The young clerk, her eyes soft with pity, confirmed the worst. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "The paperwork's been finalized. The only way to stop the auction is to pay the full amount owed." Ray's throat tightened as he asked, "How much?" The answer, $14,000 to $72,018, felt like a punch to the gut. It was nearly every penny he'd saved over a lifetime of backbreaking work and careful frugality. But hesitation never crossed his mind. If this was the price of his family's legacy, he'd pay it, no matter the cost to himself. The morning of the auction, Ray woke before the stars faded, as he had every day for over 6 decades. The pre-dawn quiet was his sanctuary, a time when he could feel Clara's presence in the creak of the floorboards and the faint scent of her lavender soap lingering in their bedroom. He showered with care, the hot water soothing his aching joints, and shaved slowly, studying his reflection in the foggy mirror. The man staring back had deep lines etched around his eyes, but those eyes still burned with determination. He chose his best shirt, a crisp blue button-down he wore only to church, and combed his thinning white hair with deliberate strokes. Standing a little taller, he adjusted his posture, knowing today was no ordinary day. Appearances mattered when you were fighting for your life's work. From beneath his mattress, Ray retrieved an old postal envelope, its edges worn from years of careful handling. Inside were neatly stacked bills, his life savings, withdrawn from the bank the day before. He counted the money twice, his fingers lingering on each bill as if to reassure himself it was real. Tucking the envelope into his jacket's inner pocket, he patted it gently, a silent promise to his ancestors that he wouldn't let them down. The 40-minute drive to the county seat was a journey through memory. Ray's 1992 Ford pickup, its once vibrant blue paint now faded to a pale, ghostly hue, rumbled along the familiar roads. He passed fields he'd plowed, fences he'd mended, and the old oak where he'd proposed to Clara under a summer moon. Each landmark stirred a quiet ache in his chest, a reminder of what was at stake. He arrived early at the government building, parking in the public lot, and watching as sleek luxury cars and polished SUVs filled the spaces around him. Men and women in tailored suits hurried past his truck, their polished shoes clicking on the pavement. Some glanced curiously at the old vehicle and its weathered driver, their eyes betraying a mix of pity and dismissal. Ray sat silently, his hands gripping the steering wheel, steeling himself for the battle ahead. Inside the building's grand meeting hall, he took a seat in the back row, the envelope in his pocket, a heavy anchor grounding him amidst the sea of unfamiliar faces. The air buzzed with anticipation, but for Ray it was laced with a quiet, desperate hope that he could save the only world he'd ever known. Ray Miller sat in the back row of the county auction hall, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he gripped the pen, filling out the participation form with a care that bordered on reverence. Each letter he etched onto the paper felt like a tether to the life he was fighting to hold on to. The room around him hummed with the self-assured chatter of real estate investors, developers, and land speculators, their voices weaving a tapestry of ambition and opportunity. Men in tailored suits and women with polished briefcases swapped stories of lucrative deals, their words dripping with confidence. Ray, in his faded jeans and scuffed work boots, felt like a shadow in their midst, an outsider in a world that had no place for him. His heart thudded heavily in his chest, not from nervousness, but from the weight of what this day meant, the last stand to save the land his family had worked for generations. As he approached the registration desk, Ray's steps were deliberate, his broad shoulders squared despite the knot of dread in his stomach. The young clerk behind the desk, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, barely looked up as she took his form. Her eyes flicked over his worn attire, lingering on the dirt-stained cuffs of his jacket, and something in her expression hardened, a subtle shift from indifference to judgment. She leaned toward her colleague, a man in a crisp button-down, and whispered something Ray couldn't catch. The colleague's gaze darted to Ray, then to the head auctioneer, a man whose expensive suit and gleaming gold watch screamed wealth. The auctioneer strode over, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum floor, and took Ray's form with a cursory glance. His lips pursed into a frown as he read. "Mr. Miller, is it?" the auctioneer said, his voice smooth but edged with condescension. "You've indicated cash payment here. I'm afraid that's not acceptable for transactions of this nature." Ray's hand instinctively went to the inside pocket of his jacket, where a thick envelope rested against his chest. "I've brought the full amount," he said, his voice steady but soft, the kind of tone that carried the weight of a man who'd spent decades working under open skies. $14,372. The auctioneer didn't let him finish. "We require a bank guarantee or certified check," he interrupted, his words sharp, cutting through Ray's quiet resolve. "Not cash in an envelope. This isn't a farmer's market." His lips twitched into a smirk, and a chuckle rippled from someone in the crowd nearby. The sound spread like wildfire, a low murmur of amusement that made Ray's face burn, though he kept his expression steady. The weight of their laughter pressed against him, each snicker a reminder of how small he must seem to them, a simple man clutching a dream they couldn't understand. There was nothing in the notice about, Ray began, his voice calm but firm, trying to anchor himself in the face of dismissal. It's standard procedure, the auctioneer cut in again, his tone final, like a door slamming shut. Security will show you out. Perhaps you can speak with the county office about proper procedures. For next time. Before Ray could respond, two security guards appeared at his sides, their presence looming but not aggressive. Their hands rested lightly on his elbows, guiding him toward the exit with a firmness that left no room for argument. As they walked, Ray heard the whispers trailing behind him, sharp and mocking. One voice rose above the rest, clear and cruel. Did he really think he could buy back his farm with cash from under his mattress? The words stung, not because they were true, but because they reduced his life savings, years of sweat, sacrifice, and hope, to a punchline. Ray didn't resist. He didn't argue. With his head held high, he pulled his worn cap lower over his eyes, shielding himself from the curious stares. His fingers tightened around the envelope in his pocket, the paper crinkling under his grip. It wasn't just money inside. It was every late night spent repairing fences, every dawn breaking over fields his father had tilled, every memory of his children playing in the barn. As he stepped out into the blinding sunlight, the door clicked shut behind him, and the muffled sounds of the auction hall faded. Unbeknownst to the crowd inside, a local reporter assigned to cover the auction for the county newspaper had been quietly filming the entire exchange. Her camera captured every word, every sneer, every moment of Ray's quiet dignity in the face of humiliation. She stood by the window, her heart heavy with the injustice she'd witnessed, knowing the footage could change the story's ending if it reached the right ears. If you believe someone trying deserves to be heard, please stay with us, she murmured to herself, already planning her next steps. In the parking lot, Ray sat on the tailgate of his battered pickup truck, the metal warm under his hands. The morning sun beat down on his shoulders, but he scarcely noticed the heat, his mind lost in a swirl of memories and regrets. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, its edges worn from handling. It was a copy of the letter he'd sent to the governor's office 2 weeks earlier, a plea written in his careful, deliberate handwriting. He smoothed out the creases, his calloused fingers tracing the words as he read them again. I'm not asking for money or special treatment. I'm only asking for a fair chance to keep what my father left me, land that has fed this county for nearly a century. Each sentence was a piece of his soul laid bare on the page. He hadn't expected a reply. Governors and their staff had bigger problems than an old farmer's fight. But the silence still cut deep. Ray had lived long enough to understand his place in the world, a small figure in a system that favored wealth and power over heart and history. Inside the auction hall, the gavel was already falling. Through the open windows, Ray could hear the auctioneer's practiced cadence, the rapid-fire rhythm of bids climbing higher and higher. Parcels of land were being snapped up by men who saw them as numbers on a ledger, not as homes or legacies. Ray glanced at his watch, its face scratched from years of wear. The Miller farm was third on the list. In just minutes, the land his great-grandfather had cleared, his father had nurtured, and he had poured his life into it belonged to someone else, someone who wouldn't know the feel of its soil or the stories it held. His chest tightened, but he didn't let the tears come. He'd learned long ago that crying changed nothing. A man emerged from the building, his face familiar from town meetings and church suppers. He spotted Ray and shook his head, his eyes heavy with sympathy. They just sold your place, he said, his voice thick with regret. Some investment group from Dallas. Didn't even ask about the property's condition. Just threw out a number and took it. Ray nodded, folding the letter carefully and slipping it back into his pocket. The words didn't surprise him, but they landed like a blow all the same. He could picture the suits from Dallas, their pens scratching signatures on documents that would erase his family's history. They wouldn't see the fields where his daughter had learned to walk, or the barn where his son had carved his initials into a beam. To them, it was just another plot, another dollar sign. Ray climbed into his truck, the door creaking as he shut it, and sat for a moment, staring at the government building across the lot. The weight of loss settled over him, heavy but familiar. He'd carry it, just as he'd carried every other hardship in his life, with quiet strength and unbroken dignity. Raymond Miller stood in the dusty parking lot, his weathered hands trembling as he slipped the folded notice back into the pocket of his worn denim jacket. The weight of the paper felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the burden of his family's legacy crumbling under the gavel of a county auction. His heart thudded with a mix of resignation and quiet fury, emotions he'd been wrestling with since the bank's final letter arrived. The man beside him, a neighbor whose own farm had narrowly escaped a similar fate, shook his head slowly. "It ain't right, Ray," he said, his voice low and rough with sympathy, but they shouldn't be able to just take it like that. Ray nodded, his throat tight with unspoken words. He wanted to agree, to rail against the injustice, but he knew better. In the cold machinery of business, fairness was a luxury few could afford. Both men stood in silence, the shared understanding hanging heavy between them, as if speaking it aloud would only deepen the wound. With a heavy sigh, Ray climbed into his old pickup truck, the door creaking with familiarity. He settled into the cracked leather seat, the faint smell of oil and earth filling the cab, a reminder of decades spent working the land. His fingers, calloused from years of toil, gripped the key and slid it into the ignition. But before he could turn it, a distant wail pierced the quiet, a sharp, insistent sound that made his heart skip. Sirens. His gaze snapped up, drawn to the commotion unfolding at the entrance to the government complex across the lot. 5 sleek black SUVs with tinted windows roared into the driveway, their tires kicking up gravel in precise, practiced arcs. Behind them, 2 police motorcycles flanked the convoy, their lights flashing with authority. The lead vehicle stood out, adorned with the state flag on its hood, a clear signal that this was no ordinary procession. It was the governor's transport. Ray's breath caught as the doors of the first 3 SUVs swung open in unison, spilling out a cadre of men and women in crisp suits. Their movements were sharp, their eyes scanning the surroundings with the precision of hawks. Security personnel and aides, Ray guessed, their presence radiating a kind of controlled urgency. Then, from the middle SUV, a figure emerged, a woman whose face was instantly recognizable, etched into the collective memory of the state through campaign ads and newsreels. Governor Karen Langford. At 58, she carried herself with an air of unyielding purpose, her reputation as a no-nonsense leader preceding her like a shadow. Her dark blazer and sharp posture spoke of efficiency, but Ray knew her occasional flair for political theater could shift the ground beneath anyone's feet. She strode toward the complex entrance, her steps deliberate, her gaze fixed ahead. Reporters seemed to materialize from the air itself, shouting questions that hung unanswered as she swept past, her entourage a silent barrier against the clamor. Ray sat frozen, the key still untouched in the ignition, his mind racing to make sense of the scene. The governor, here, at a routine county property auction? It was absurd, like seeing a thunderstorm erupt in a clear sky. His thoughts churned with disbelief and a flicker of hope he didn't dare entertain. Inside the auction hall, the proceedings marched on, oblivious to the spectacle outside. Representatives from an investment group huddled in a corner, their voices low but brimming with ambition as they discussed their plans for the Miller farm. They spoke of sprawling housing developments, strip malls, and commercial complexes, visions that would erase the fields Ray's family had tended for generations. Their words floated through the room, mingling with the murmurs of neighboring bidders, all caught up in the promise of profit. The atmosphere shifted abruptly when the large double doors at the back of the hall swung open with a dramatic thud. Conversations halted, half-formed sentences dangling in the air as Governor Langford entered, flanked by her chief of staff and a pair of security guards whose presence seemed to shrink the room. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, swept across the crowd, locking onto the auctioneer at the front. The man, usually composed behind his podium, faltered under her gaze, his hands fumbling with his gavel. "This proceeding is temporarily suspended," Langford announced, her voice cutting through the room with a clarity that needed no amplification. The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling shock through the crowd. "Where is Raymond Miller?" she demanded. The auctioneer, now visibly flustered, gestured vaguely toward the exit. "He was asked to leave," he stammered, his usual authority unraveling under the weight of her presence. Langford's eyes narrowed and she turned to one of her aides. "Find him," she instructed, her tone leaving no room for delay. The aide nodded and moved swiftly, disappearing through the doors. Ray, still in his truck, was startled when a suited figure approached, tapping on his window. His heart pounded as he stepped out, clutching his cap in his hands, the brim worn soft from years of nervous twisting. The aide led him back to the complex, and before he could process the moment, he found himself face to face with Governor Karen Langford. "Mr. Miller," she said, extending a hand with a warmth that contrasted her commanding demeanor. Ray shook it, his rough palm meeting her steady grip, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and awe. "I received your letter last night," she continued, her voice softening just enough to hint at sincerity. Ray blinked, his breath catching. The letter, a desperate, late-night plea he'd scrawled in a fit of desperation, never expecting it to reach her desk, let alone prompt this moment. "I didn't think... I never expected you to read it, ma'am," he managed, his voice rough with disbelief. Langford's lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes remained sharp. "I read every letter that crosses my desk," she said, and though Ray suspected this was a polite exaggeration, her conviction made it feel true. Sometimes they arrive at just the right moment. She turned to her chief of staff, a wiry man with a tablet already in hand. "Issue an administrative hold on the Miller property transaction," she instructed, her voice crisp. "Cite Regulation 42B for improper notification of sale terms." The aide nodded, his fingers flying across the screen. Ray's head spun, the words barely registering. "I don't understand," he said, his gaze darting between the governor and her staff, searching for clarity. Langford's expression softened further, a rare glimpse of empathy breaking through her polished exterior. "Mr. Miller, your letter reached my office just as we were finalizing an investigation into land acquisition practices across the state," she explained. "There have been irregularities, particularly with family farms like yours. We're stepping in to ensure justice is done." Ray's chest tightened, a flood of emotions, hope, disbelief, gratitude, threatening to overwhelm him. The land his family had poured their lives into, the fields where he'd played as a bone and worked as a man, might not be lost after all. The governor's words were a lifeline, fragile but real, and for the first time in months, Ray allowed himself to believe that fairness might still have a place in the world. Raymond Miller stood in the dusty county auction hall, his weathered face a mask of stoic resolve, betraying none of the storm raging within. Decades of toiling under the sun, wrestling with unpredictable harvests and relentless financial strain, had forged an ironclad ability to conceal his emotions. Hope had long been a scarce commodity in his life, eroded by years of loss and struggle. Yet despair, too, was something he refused to let take root. Today, he faced the unthinkable. The auction of his family's farm, a legacy stretching back to 1927, a piece of earth that held not just his livelihood, but the very essence of his identity. As the auctioneer's gavel loomed, Ray's heart pounded with a quiet dread, though his expression remained as unyielding as the oak trees lining his property. Outside, the governor's voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd, sharp and authoritative. "The requirement for bank guarantees instead of cash wasn't disclosed in your auction notice," she declared, her tone laced with indignation. "That's a clear violation of state transparency laws. Furthermore, my office has uncovered multiple procedural errors in the original tax assessment that led to this auction." Her words sent a ripple through the gathered bidders and spectators, who had moments ago dismissed Ray as just another old farmer out of his depth. Inside the hall, the air grew thick with anticipation. People shuffled toward the windows, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the extraordinary scene unfolding in the parking lot. An elderly man, weathered by time, standing toe-to-toe with the state's highest official. Ray's chest tightened as he processed the governor's words. His mind churned with a mix of disbelief and cautious hope, emotions he hadn't dared entertain in years. "I'm just a farmer, ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady, though it carried the weight of a lifetime spent coaxing life from the soil. "I don't know much about regulations or procedures. All I know is that land's been in my family since 1927. His words hung in the air, simple yet profound, a testament to a legacy that had weathered droughts, economic crashes, and personal loss. The governor nodded, her eyes softening with understanding. "Yes, Mr. Miller, your letter to my office made that abundantly clear," she said, her voice warm but resolute. Family farms like yours are the heartbeat of this state. They're what built us, and they're what keep us grounded." Her words struck Ray like a bolt of lightning. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he found himself at a loss for words. He had arrived at the auction prepared to lose everything: his home, his heritage, his pride. He had steeled himself against the sting of humiliation, the final blow of defeat. But hope? Hope was a stranger he hadn't prepared to meet. In the distance, a young reporter adjusted her camera, her heart racing as she captured the unlikely scene. The governor, impeccably dressed and radiating authority, stood beside Ray's battered pickup truck, its faded paint a stark contrast to her polished presence. The reporter had already filmed Ray's earlier ejection from the auction hall, a moment that had left her stomach churning with sympathy for the old man's quiet dignity. Now she zoomed in on this new development, her lens framing the governor's earnest conversation with the farmer. She knew this footage would tell a story far bigger than the county parking lot. Type fairness if you believe patience and dignity deserve to be heard. By nightfall, the reporter's video had exploded across the internet. The initial clip of Ray being escorted out of the auction, his head held high despite the indignity, followed by the governor's unexpected intervention, spread like wildfire. Within hours, it had garnered over 100,000 views. By morning, that number had skyrocketed past 1 million. News outlets across the state seized the story, their headlines screaming with righteous fervor: "Farmer humiliated, Governor intervenes, ancestral land saved, justice for elderly farmer, David versus Goliath, 73-year-old stands up to system and wins." The public's response was visceral, a collective outcry against the injustice Ray had faced in a celebration of the governor's stand. The auction company, caught in the crosshairs of public outrage, issued a carefully crafted apology. They cited a miscommunication regarding acceptable payment methods and promised a thorough review of their internal procedures. Behind closed doors, their executives scrambled to contain the damage, aware that their reputation hung in the balance. Meanwhile, the investment firm that had eyed Ray's farm as a quick acquisition quietly withdrew, especially after state regulators announced a sweeping investigation into their recent land purchases. The firm's executives, once confident in their ability to snap up rural properties, now faced the uncomfortable glare of scrutiny. 3 days after the auction, Ray's phone rang, the sound jarring in the quiet of his modest kitchen. It was a call from the governor's office, requesting his presence at the county administration building, the very place where he had endured such public humiliation just days before. As he drove his aging pickup truck to the meeting, Ray's mind was a tangle of emotions. He felt a flicker of apprehension, tempered by the stubborn resilience that had carried him through decades of hardship. What did they want with him now? Was this another bureaucratic trap? Or could it be something else? Something better? When he arrived, the atmosphere was starkly different from his last visit. County staff greeted him by name, their voices warm and respectful. One offered him a cup of coffee, another guided him to a conference room where several officials waited. Ray's worn boots felt out of place on the polished floor, but he squared his shoulders and stepped inside. The county administrator, a man with a crisp suit and a sincere expression, stood to greet him. "Mr. Miller," he began, his tone heavy with regret, "we owe you a personal apology for the treatment you received at the auction. It was unacceptable and does not reflect the values of this county." Ray nodded, his throat tight. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, and it made him uneasy, but the acknowledgement stirred something deep within, a sense of validation he hadn't realized he craved. The administrator continued, "Governor Langford has ordered a full review of your property's tax status. We've identified several errors in the processing of your late wife's estate, which wrongly triggered the tax delinquency notice." He slid a folder across the table, its contents outlining the mistakes that had nearly cost Ray everything. As Ray listened, a weight began to lift, replaced by a cautious optimism that felt both foreign and fragile. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the system could work in his favor. Ray Miller sat at the polished oak table, his calloused fingers tracing the edges of a stack of legal documents adorned with embossed seals that gleamed under the sterile fluorescent lights. The weight of the past few months pressed heavily on his chest, nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if the land his family had tilled for generations would slip through his fingers like dry soil. The administrator, a woman with a kind but professional demeanor, leaned forward, her voice steady as she broke down the legalese into words Rye could grasp. The tax dispute has been settled, Mr. Miller. The auction that threatened your farm has been overturned, and full ownership of your property has been restored to you. Her words landed like rain on parched earth, soaking into Rye's weary soul, though he hardly dared believe them. Relief mingled with suspicion, a guarded hope flickering in his weathered heart. Before he could fully process the news, the woman from the governor's office slid another document across the table, her eyes softening. "There's more," she said, her tone carrying a hint of intrigue. "Someone has stepped forward to help with any lingering financial burdens tied to your farm." Rye's brow furrowed, his pride bristling like a cornered animal. Charity was a word that tasted bitter to him, a concept that clashed with the self-reliance etched into his bones. "I don't take handouts," he said gruffly, his voice low but firm, the stubborn resolve of a man who'd faced drought, debt, and despair without bowing. The woman shook her head gently, her smile reassuring. "It's not charity, Mr. Miller." The individual was very clear about that. The document before him revealed an extraordinary truth. An anonymous donor had established a trust, not only to clear any remaining tax debts, but also to fund essential repairs to bring the Miller farm up to modern agricultural standards. Rye's eyes, clouded with years of toil and worry, scanned the paper, his hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from the weight of an unexpected kindness. Who could this be? His mind raced, sifting through decades of faces, neighbors, and strangers he'd crossed paths with on this unforgiving land. The woman's smile widened as she handed him a sealed envelope. "They wanted to remain anonymous, but they left this for you." With careful fingers, Rye opened the envelope, revealing a single sheet of paper with neat, deliberate handwriting. The words carried him back to a time he'd nearly forgotten, a memory buried beneath the dust of years. "Mr. Miller," the note began, "when I was 10, my family lost everything in the drought of '94. My father was out of work, and we couldn't afford food. You gave us vegetable seeds and taught him how to grow them, even though your own farm was struggling. You probably don't recall. It was just one of many kindnesses you have shown. But that garden kept us fed until my father found work again. I'm now the CEO of a technology company. What you gave us wasn't just food, it was dignity, hope, a chance to stand tall again. This trust is my way of repaying a debt I've carried for years. A child who once ran through your fields." The words struck Rye like a thunderclap, stirring a vague recollection of a family from that brutal year. He remembered their hollowed faces, the desperation in the father's eyes, the way the children clung to hope despite their hunger. Sharing seeds and a bit of know-how had felt as natural to Rye as breathing. He'd never thought twice about it. Now those small acts of generosity had returned to him in a way he could scarcely comprehend. His throat tightened, and he blinked hard, fighting the unfamiliar sting of tears. "Is this real?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, tinged with a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. The representative nodded, her expression warm. "Very real, Mr. Miller. Your benefactor was adamant about helping once they heard of your plight. They contacted our office almost the same day your letter reached us." Rye's story, it turned out, had rippled far beyond his quiet corner of the world. A video of him speaking plainly about his fight to save his farm had spread like wildfire across the internet, striking a chord with people from all walks of life. To some, Rye embodied the rugged independence and deep-rooted values they cherished. A man who worked the land with his own hands and asked for nothing but the chance to keep what was his. To others, he was a symbol of resilience in the face of systemic inequities, a farmer caught in the gears of corporate greed and bureaucratic indifference. For once, people who rarely agreed on anything found themselves united in their admiration for an elderly man's quiet determination to hold on to his family's legacy. 2 weeks after the auction was halted, Rye received another call from the governor's office. This time, they invited him to speak at the state agricultural fair, an event typically reserved for polished politicians and industry bigwigs, not weathered farmers like him. The invitation felt surreal, like a dream he hadn't dared to dream. On the morning of the fair, Rye stood before his cracked bedroom mirror, buttoning his Sunday shirt with care, his fingers steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. He combed his thinning hair with the same precision he'd once used to plant rows of corn, each motion deliberate, grounding him in the face of the unknown. As he drove to the fairgrounds, the hum of his old truck was a familiar comfort, though his mind churned with doubts. What could he, a man of few words, say to a crowd of thousands? At the fairgrounds, the air buzzed with the energy of the crowd, families, farmers, and curious onlookers gathered under a wide blue sky. Rye was ushered to a waiting area behind the main stage, where Governor Langford greeted him with a warm handshake. Her presence was commanding yet approachable, and Rye felt a flicker of awe standing so close to someone he'd only seen on television. "Nervous?" she asked, her eyes crinkling with understanding. Rye gave a small nod, his honesty disarming. "Yes, ma'am, not used to talking to crowds." The governor's smile was encouraging, her voice steady. "Just speak from your heart, Mr. Miller. That's what caught everyone's attention in the first place." When Rye's name was announced, the crowd's applause rolled over him like a wave, warm and overwhelming. He stepped onto the stage, his boots heavy against the wooden platform, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment he stood silent, looking out at the sea of faces, some familiar, most strangers, all waiting to hear from the farmer whose story had touched their hearts. He gripped the podium, his weathered hands steadying him, and took a deep breath. This was his land, his life, his truth. And as he began to speak, his voice carried the weight of every sunrise he'd greeted, every harvest he'd fought for, and every small kindness he'd given without expecting anything in return. Ray Miller stood at the edge of the fairgrounds, his weathered boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and quiet pride. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, their faces a blur of curiosity and admiration. Many of them knew only fragments of his story, a farmer who'd faced down an auction to save his family's land. Their murmurs carried a polite respect, but Ray could feel the weight of their incomplete understanding. He wasn't here for their pity or their praise. He was here to speak his truth, to honor the legacy that had nearly slipped through his fingers. As he approached the microphone, his calloused hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the gravity of the moment. Behind him, massive screens flickered to life, replaying the now iconic footage. Ray, head held high, being escorted from the auction hall, his life savings clutched in a worn envelope, followed by the governor's unexpected intervention. The crowd's applause swelled, no longer just polite but fervent, a wave of genuine emotion washing over him. Ray reached into his pocket, pulling out that same old envelope. It was empty now, its contents long spent in his desperate bid to save his farm, but it carried a weight far heavier than money. It was a symbol of his fight, his refusal to let go of the land that had cradled his family for generations. He held it up, and the crowd hushed, their eyes fixed on him. "I came to that auction to save my family's legacy," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "I didn't come begging for charity. I came with every dollar I'd scraped together over a lifetime, asking only for a fair shot." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces, each one a stranger yet somehow tied to his story. "What I got was more than fairness. I got a reminder that some things can't be priced, not the history of a family, not the land that fed us, not the dignity of honest work." His words hung in the air, raw and unpolished, but they struck a chord. Ray's chest tightened as he saw tears glisten in the eyes of strangers, their hands clasped together or pressed to their hearts. He thought of his father, who'd worked this land until his hands bled, and his grandmother, who'd told stories of their ancestors' first harvests under starlit skies. This wasn't just about him. It was about all of them, the generations who'd poured their lives into the soil. By the time he stepped back from the microphone, his heart was full, not with triumph, but with gratitude for being heard. The governor joined him on stage, his presence commanding yet warm. He placed a hand on Ray's shoulder, and the crowd erupted again as he announced a new initiative to protect family farms from predatory developers and corporate greed. Ray stood there, his weathered face betraying a flicker of disbelief. He hadn't set out to change laws or inspire policies. He'd only wanted to keep what was his. But as he looked out at the crowd, he felt a shift. His story had grown beyond him, touching hearts and sparking change in the ways he could scarcely comprehend. What Ray didn't fully grasp, And what the audience couldn't yet see was that his viral moment had ignited a movement. He'd become a symbol of defiance against the cold machinery of modern commerce, a living testament to the human stories behind every auction notice, every tax bill, every piece of land sold to the highest bidder. As he left the stage to thunderous applause, a young reporter pushed through the crowd, her notebook clutched tightly. "Mr. Miller, how does it feel to have influenced state policy?" she asked, her voice eager. Ray paused, his eyes crinkling with a humility that ran as deep as the roots of his farm. "I'm just a farmer," he said softly. "Always have been, always will be. If my story helps someone else hold on to their land, then something good came out of this mess." But in that moment, Ray Miller was more than a farmer. He was a beacon of resilience, a reminder that values like family, hard work, and dignity could still hold sway in a world that often seemed to forget them. He was proof that justice, though rare, could still find its way through the cracks of an indifferent system. A month later, Ray was back on his farm, the frenetic hum of media attention fading like the last notes of a song. The quiet rhythms of his daily life, feeding the livestock, checking the crops, listening to the hum of the wind through the fields, felt like a homecoming to his soul. The world had moved on, as it always does, but the ripples of his story lingered in ways both grand and small. The most tangible changes were to the farm itself. An anonymous donor's generosity had breathed new life into the property. The barn, once sagging under a leaking roof, now stood proud with fresh shingles, its red paint gleaming under the sun. The irrigation system, a patchwork of fixes cobbled together over decades, now ran smoothly, ensuring the fields would thrive for years to come. The farmhouse, too, had been brought into the modern age with a safer electrical system, yet its century-old charm remained untouched. The creaky porch swing, the faded wallpaper in the kitchen, the worn floorboards that carried the echoes of his family's footsteps. But the change that meant the most to Ray was simpler, more profound. At the entrance to the property, a new hand-carved sign hung on the weathered wooden gate. It read, "Miller Farm, established 1927, restored 2021. Ray traced his fingers over the freshly painted letters, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. This sign was more than wood and paint. It was a bridge between the past and the future, a promise that his family's legacy would endure. He thought of his children, who'd grown up running through these fields, and of the grandchildren he hoped would one day do the same. The farm wasn't just land, it was a living story, and he'd fought to keep its pages turning. The farm had also become a local landmark, a place where history and hope intertwined. School groups now visited, their young voices filling the air as they learned about traditional farming methods, how to plant by hand, how to care for livestock, how to read the seasons in the sky. Neighbors, once distant, now stopped by with casseroles or offers to lend a hand, their faces lit with a newfound respect. Ray felt their warmth, but he also felt the weight of his role as a reluctant hero. He didn't want fame, he wanted the quiet satisfaction of a day's work under the open sky. Yet he couldn't deny the good that had come from his moment in the spotlight, not just for him, but for others who might now keep their own land because of the policies his story had inspired. As Ray stood by the gate, the evening sun casting long shadows across the fields, he felt a deep peace settle over him. The fight had been worth it, not just for the farm, but for the reminder that kindness, like the seeds he planted, could take root and grow in ways no one could predict. He was still a farmer, yes, but he was also a man who'd stood up for what mattered, and in doing so had given others the courage to do the same. On a sun-dappled Saturday morning, Raymond Miller, known to all as Rye, was out mending a weathered section of fence on his family's sprawling farm. The air was thick with the scent of earth and blooming wildflowers, and sweat beaded on his forehead as he hammered a post into the stubborn ground. His hands, calloused from years of toil, moved with a rhythm born of decades spent nurturing this land. It was a labor of love, but also one of defiance, a quiet stand against the forces that had once threatened to strip this place from him. Rye's heart carried the weight of memory, each fence post a testament to his family's legacy, a bulwark against a world that seemed to value progress over roots. He paused, wiping his brow, when the crunch of tires on gravel broke the morning stillness. A minivan rolled into his driveway, its engine humming softly before falling silent. A family stepped out, parents and two children, their faces bright with curiosity and a touch of nervous excitement. The younger child, a boy no older than 10, clutched a school notebook tightly, his knuckles pale from the grip. The father, a man with kind eyes and a hesitant smile, approached. "Mr. Miller," he called, his voice tinged with respect and a hint of apology for the intrusion. "I hope we're not interrupting. My son Tommy is working on a school project about local history. He was hoping to ask you a few questions about your farm." The words hung in the air, and Rye felt a flicker of surprise, followed by a warmth that spread through his chest. He wasn't used to visitors seeking his story, not after years of being just another farmer in a world that often overlooked men like him. Rye set his hammer down, the metal clinking softly against the wood, and wiped his hands on a faded rag tucked into his overalls. His weathered face softened, and a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Happy to help," he said, his voice steady but carrying the gravelly warmth of someone who spoke sparingly but meant every word. He gestured for the family to come closer, noting the boy's cautious steps, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and uncertainty. Tommy hesitated, then found his courage. "Is it true the governor came here because of you?" he asked, his voice small but eager, pen poised over his notebook. Rye chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to rise from deep within him. He leaned against a fence post, his gaze drifting across the fields that stretched out like a patchwork quilt under the morning sun. "Not because of me, son," he said, his tone thoughtful, as if he were piecing together the answer for himself as much as for the boy. "Because of what I represent." Tommy's brow furrowed, his pen still. "What's that?" he pressed, his curiosity burning brighter. Rye paused, his eyes tracing the horizon where the land met the sky. He felt the weight of the question, the way it pulled at the core of everything he'd fought for. "It's the idea," he began slowly, choosing each word with care, "that some things are worth standing up for, even when the odds are stacked against you. It's about holding fast to what you believe in, even when it feels like no one's listening. Sometimes you've got to raise your voice, not for yourself, but for what's right." His words carried a quiet conviction, born from sleepless nights spent worrying over tax notices and the looming threat of losing the only home he'd ever known. He thought of the letters he'd written, the pleas to officials who seemed deaf to his cause, and the moment he'd realized that giving up wasn't in his blood. Tommy scribbled furiously, his small hands struggling to keep up with Rye's words. Rye watched the boy, a pang of pride swelling in his chest. He saw something of himself in Tommy's earnestness, a reminder of the boy he'd been, running through these same fields, dreaming under the shade of the old oak tree. Turning to the family, he gestured toward the expanse of his property. "Come on," he said, his voice lighter now. "Let me show you around." As they walked, Rye's boots sank into the familiar earth, each step stirring memories that clung to him like the scent of the soil. He led them to the ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like an old friend reaching out. "My grandfather planted this," he said, resting a hand on the rough bark, his fingers tracing the grooves as if they could unlock the stories trapped within. He spoke of his grandfather's hands, weathered like his own, planting the sapling with a hope that it would outlive him. The family listened, their eyes wide as Rye's voice wove a tapestry of the past, his love for the land palpable in every word. They moved on to a field, its soil dark and rich, where Rye's father had once toiled during the Dust Bowl. Rye's heart ached as he recounted his father's experiments with drought-resistant crops, the way he'd poured his soul into coaxing life from a land that seemed determined to wither. "He never gave up," Rye said, his voice catching slightly. "Even when the dust storms came and hope was scarce, he believed in this place." The parents nodded, their faces soft with understanding, while the children gazed at the field, trying to imagine a time so different from their own. By the small stream that wound through the property, Rye paused, a smile breaking through the lines etched on his face. "This is where I used to play," he said, his eyes distant, seeing not the family before him, but the boy he'd been, splashing in the cool water, chasing minnows under the summer sun. He knelt by the stream, pointing out the smooth stones polished by years of gentle current. "History isn't just in books," he told Tommy, his voice earnest. It's right here, in the land under your feet. Every blade of grass, every tree, every ripple in this stream, it's all part of the story. The family lingered, asking questions, their voices mingling with the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a hawk. When they finally left, Rye stood in the driveway, watching the minivan disappear down the road. He felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense that he'd passed something precious to that boy, something that might take root in him as surely as the oak had taken root in the earth. That afternoon, Rye sat on his porch, the wood creaking under his weight as he watched the sunset paint the fields in hues of gold and crimson. Long shadows stretched across the land, a land he'd nearly lost to cold bureaucracy and unpaid taxes. His heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Just that morning, a small package had arrived from the state capitol, its contents heavy with meaning. Inside was a framed copy of the Family Farm Preservation Initiative, the governor's signature scrawled across it, accompanied by a handwritten note. "Mr. Miller," it read, "your courage reminded us all that government should serve people, not processes. Thank you for your letter." Rye's throat tightened as he read it again, his fingers brushing the frame. He thought of the countless nights spent drafting that letter, pouring his heart onto the page, never expecting it to reach so far. Inside his modest farmhouse, Rye approached the central wooden post that had held the structure upright for nearly a century. It was more than timber. It was the spine of his home, the anchor of his family's history. From his pocket, he pulled a small handmade plaque, its edges worn from his touch. He'd carved it himself, the words simple but profound. "This isn't just land, it's memory." He nailed it to the post, the hammer's echo filling the quiet house. Standing back, he felt a surge of pride, not just for himself, but for every Miller who'd worked this land before him. Weeks later, when a national news program persuaded Rye for an interview, he faced the cameras with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through his fight. The reporter asked about his newfound influence, the way his story had rippled across the state, even to the governor's desk. Rye's gaze drifted to the fields beyond, their golden expanse shimmering under the setting sun. "I didn't change the world," he said, his voice steady but humble, the words carrying the weight of a man who'd never sought the spotlight. "I just reminded folks that people like me, farmers who work the land, who keep their word, who hold history close, we still matter in this fast-moving world." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting Miller Farm in a glow that seemed to hold time itself, Rye sat once more on his porch. He thought of the battles he'd fought, the letters written, the sleepless nights when hope felt like a distant star. His victory wasn't just about saving his farm. It was about something bigger, a rebalancing of a world that too often favored wealth and power over quiet perseverance. The land was safe, but more than that, an idea had been preserved. That sometimes, just sometimes, the system could still bend toward justice, recognizing the worth of things that couldn't be counted in dollars. Rye's heart was full, not with pride, but with a quiet certainty that his fight had mattered, not just for him, but for anyone who believed in standing tall for what was right.